like a death of the heart. Jesus, where do I start? You're still the one pool where I'd happily drown. And oh, take me off your mailing list for the kids that think it still exists. Yeah, for those who think it still exists. Maybe you're right, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe you're right, and maybe I'm wrong, and maybe you're right, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe you're right. And oh, maybe mother told you true, and there'll always be something there for you, and you'll never be alone. But maybe she's wrong, and maybe I'm right, and maybe she's wrong, and maybe I'm right, and maybe I'm right, and maybe she's wrong, and just maybe I'm right. And if so, is there? To access the exhibits at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, you ride a downward escalator in the dark for what feels like an hour. You then traverse a cavernous hallway with audio and visual projections of the text from accounts recorded by other visitors about their first-person experiences or last moments with a loved one who never came home again. It is the land of the dead. The walls of the museums are exhibits themselves, as many of them are the last physical survivors of a tragedy with shockwaves felt throughout the world to this very day. Impossibly twisted, massive pieces of the broken Twin Towers lay stark and almost shamefully exposed to people as they struggle to comprehend the true scale of the destruction. The thousands of faces and names on display of those who lost their lives that day engulf and oppress with so much psychic weight. I found myself less able to take in the exhibits the longer I stayed. I began taking photos of things that were important and then moving quickly through to the next exhibit and the next. When I got to the section on rescue dogs that died trying to save their people, I was finally overwhelmed with tears and I had to run through to the end. The slowness of the ride back up the escalator made me wonder if I was going to make it out. Official counts say that 3,000 people were killed in the attacks and another 6,000 were injured. Nearly all were civilians. Countless more bear the scars of losing loved ones in the attacks and the rescue efforts. This event remains the deadliest terrorist attack in not just US history, but in world history. It is the event that caused us to occupy Afghanistan in the first place. Since America entered the technological age of mass communication, nearly every generation has a major national event where everyone remembers where they were when they heard the news. There was the bombing of Pearl Harbor in the 1940s and Kennedy's assassination in the 1960s. For us, it is the 9/11 attacks. Yes, I was on the street in downtown Manhattan on September 11th, 2001. Today I will try to bring to life what it is like to be on the street on that terrible day and what I experienced in the days and weeks immediately after. I also have the gift of being still alive and able to share with you how this experience has imprinted and affected me for the last 20 years. Very little of it will be pretty, but it is all real. What I share here today is distinctly and uniquely mine. It is also ours as Americans and as citizens of the world alive today. I knew several years ago that I needed to write and perform this piece. As I reflect on why I am doing this, there are two separate impulses. One is that I am far enough away to recognize its value as history now. After watching bored kids wind their way through the World Trade Center Museum in June of this year, I realized that I am that history too, but I am alive and talking in breath and blood. So maybe I can reach some of them in a way that no stop on an exhausting family vacation ever could. The other impulse is purely selfish. One of the fundamentals of drama, whether it be film or live performance, is that it is successful if it is cathartic. I hope that by examining these things that live within me and in some way shape my life still, and by bearing them to you here and now, I can clear myself a path towards some sort of peace. I did consider reaching out to other people who were there and who have even more frightening experiences than my own. After wrestling with who to select, what to ask, and how to use the material, I realized that it probably wasn't healthy to spend more time than absolutely necessary in this world. I am an expert on the subject myself. I have plenty of raw material and cold, dissociative, analytical ability to do it on my own. By me, about me, for me, and for you. I want to acknowledge that Philadelphia had a key role in both the immediate and ongoing search and rescue operations. On a visit to the Philadelphia Firemen's Hall Museum in 2nd and Race, I learned that our city had a rare, specially trained team of emergency workers who were on the scene within 2 hours. If you are looking for a memorial to honor the local heroes who died or survived that rescue effort, I strongly suggest visiting that museum. It's just a couple blocks that way. When it came down to actually writing this, I found it just as emotionally exhausting as I expected. Some of you may be disappointed that I won't be quoting a bunch of sources for every statement I make, or that sometimes I relied on the top few internet search results or Wikipedia. I couldn't let spending too much time in this world drain me any further. I have done my best. When I was 18, I went to New York City to study dramatic writing at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. Just months earlier, I'd graduated as salutatorian from Philly's Creative and Performing Arts High School on South Broad as a creative writing major. I was no stranger to big, dirty East Coast cities, but New York immediately intimidated me by its sheer scale and its extremes. It seemed to have its own canyons and dust storms, and you could find anything or anyone from any corner of the globe at any time, as long as you could afford it, and all that long before cell phones gave the ability to everyone. New York contains so much energy that it has its own gravitational pull. Just 1 week into soaking up and attempting to adapt to this new dimension, I woke up and found a message from my mom at 9:14 a.m. What is going on up there? The Twin Towers have been crashed into? Are things in chaos? We just heard it on the radio. This is obviously a retaliation for the Bin Laden attacks. Let me know how things are. My response, well, I haven't been outside my room yet, so this is the first I heard about it. I do hear a lot of sirens, but I hear that all the time anyway. I'll let you know if anything happens. I was encouraged to write an account of what I witnessed that day. I sent it in an email to several people at 10:30 p.m. on 9/11/2001. It was titled, "Here is what everyone wanted me to write." It was published in the Philly Creative and Performing Arts High School's United Writers and Artists magazine. I wanted nothing to do with it until very recently. I must pause here to say thank you to the moms who keep the important memories tucked away under our beds until we are old enough to realize how valuable they are. That is how I came into possession of it again years later. I will read it to you now. I did not want to retype it, so I have it on different paper. There were far too many people on the streets today, even for a weekday in New York. I was on my way to my first class that starts at 11 a.m. and I have to trek 3 blocks on East 14th Street, then 8 blocks on Broadway, heading downtown to get there. Normally there are plenty of people to help refine and quicken my reflexes and navigational skills, but this day is different. I never watch TV or listen to the radio in the mornings, so I really had no idea what was going on a mile and a half away. When I got up at 9:30, the first tower was already hit. The sirens were constantly in the background, but I hardly noticed them. Anyone living in New York, or any city at all, knows how you grow accustomed to traffic noises and filter them all out after a while. I checked my email and received a message from my mom. She asked me if I was all right and told me something about the World Trade Center, but I was still half asleep, so it didn't make much sense. I responded saying I was fine, but that I had to get to class. I mean, why wouldn't we have class if the World Trade Center was in a little trouble? Didn't affect me. Walking into the lobby of my residence hall, I began to see what was happening. I saw other kids from my building embracing businessmen in expensive suits, bawling on each other's shoulders. I stepped outside and noticed that the street was a little more pedestrian-heavy than normal. I continued on my way to class, hoping all the dodging I had to do wouldn't make me late. By the time I got to Broadway, I felt like I'd stepped into a bad action movie. The streets were chaotic. The sidewalks were filled to capacity with people, and some spilled over the curb into the street. No one cared if a car was trying to get through or whether the light was green or red. They simply moved en masse, steadily and swiftly uptown. Thousands of people moved on foot, all in one direction, as if they were being herded. I noticed that the crowd was mostly business people, which is not typical of the area. I started to second-guess my plans to go to class, but decided to forge ahead anyway. Downtown I went, like swimming upstream through rapids. On my way, I picked up snippets of conversation. People crossing over the Brooklyn Bridge on foot. How else are they going to get there? Terrorists. The Pentagon now. Terrorists. Can't get out of the city. Closed. Terrorists. I watched people cursing their cell phones. I saw lines at payphones. I watched police directing pedestrian traffic and automobiles. I saw people hurrying down the street holding their stomachs, trying to hold down its contents. I watched businessmen with gray hair run past everyone else, briefcases in hand, screaming hysterically, crying. Finally, the thick panic in the air began to seep into me. I searched frantically for someone, anyone I might recognize from school, who could tell me what was happening. But I kept going the wrong way through New York, all alone in a national crisis. "Liz," I heard someone call. It was my roommate, Sarah. "I just saw the Twin Towers fall," she said in a shaky, teary voice. "And they just hit the Pentagon." I was stunned. We turned around and headed home, holding hands just to know that we weren't alone. More businessmen and their children were outside the building when we got there. The destruction felt so much closer. We were helpless and we knew it. We were right down the street from a violent siege on America, and there was nothing we could do but huddle in our rooms and watch the news. On the news, I saw people jumping out of 80th-story windows because they didn't want to wait for the fire to consume them or for the 20 floors above to crush them. I saw people running in the streets covered with white powder and blood. I heard about the people in wheelchairs watching the others running past them down the stairs, knowing they themselves would never make it out alive. I saw the plane blow out the side of the second tower, imagining all the fathers and mothers inside. The fathers and mothers. Now there are an untold number of children without a father and without a mother. Some were going through their daily routine. Some were doing their jobs trying to save lives and lost their own in the process. Children kiss their parents goodbye for the last time today. Now the streets are quieter. An occasional siren blows, an occasional someone walks by. The city is wounded and tired now, shocked, dazed, eerie. Phones are working again. Families and friends know we are safe. But although most of us are sitting with friends now, talking and trying to act normal, we do not really feel safe. What happens now? Is it all over, save for counting bodies pulled from the debris? Do we say goodbye to all our male friends who will be sent off to war? Will we all be wiped out in a single breath by a nuclear blast next week? It is 10:30 p.m. on September 11th. I have not seen a single soul smile in New York today. I remember that the next morning, 9:12, the New Jersey Transit trains were the first transportation up and running out of Manhattan. I had a group of very close friends in the South Jersey area, and one of them was at Rutgers, New Brunswick. Since I could take the New Jersey Transit trains from Manhattan to there, we arranged that they would pick me up at the train station and give me a ride back to their neighborhood closer to Cherry Hill. I walked west down 14th from 4th Avenue to 8th Avenue, where trains were running to Penn Station. I will never forget how quiet it was. No traffic was allowed further downtown than 14th, and a few vehicles ventured down even that far. Large uniformed guards with huge guns stood at every intersection to enforce the traffic ban. I remember watching a van park near Union Square. An all-Asian news crew of about 6 people jumped out and took off on foot, running with their clumsy and expensive equipment to cover the event. The subway ride from 14th to Penn Station was slow and somber and tense. At one point, it ground to a halt completely in the tunnel between stations. New Yorkers never look at each other while commuting, but in that moment we met each other's gazes with the same "not again" expressions. Just the day before, dozens of people died on New York subway and Jersey PATH trains when the tunnel collapsed and flooded. Was it our turn today? The lights dimmed and flickered as we sat there. It was one of the longest 5 minutes of my life. I don't remember anything more about my ride out except for one brief moment of seeing my friends pull up in their car at my destination and finally feeling relief. I was back in New York City by Monday morning because classes resumed and life was expected to carry on as normal. I have a letter from the president of NYU to the parents, which in the coldest CYA administrative way assures the parents that the institution is handling their children's housing and other needs. The city must be strong and resilient, so classes will resume and life will carry on. All of the officials up to the federal government assured us that it was safe and we were in no danger from the rubble and cleanup effort. I remember the city air on Lower Manhattan stunk differently, like burnt plastic and hair, all the way until Thanksgiving. All of us who were there knew they were wrong or lying, but we were doing the resilience thing we were told to do and carrying on. I'd like to share with you some quotes from just the first internet search result for what chemicals were in the air 9/11, naturally a Wikipedia article. The dust from the collapsed towers was wildly toxic, according to air pollution expert and University of California Davis Professor Emeritus Tom Cahill. Much of the thousands of tons of debris resulting from the collapse of the Twin Towers was pulverized concrete, which is known to cause silicosis upon inhalation. The remainder consisted of more than 2,500 contaminants, more specifically, 50% non-fibrous material and construction debris, 40% glass and other fibers, 9.2% cellulose, and 0.8% of the extremely toxic carcinogen asbestos, as well as detectable amounts of lead and mercury. There were also unprecedented levels of dioxins and PAHs from the fires, which burned for 3 months. Many of the dispersed substances, asbestos, crystalline silica, lead, cadmium, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, are carcinogenic. Other substances can trigger kidney, heart, liver, and nervous system deterioration. This was well known by the EPA at the time of collapse. The World Trade Center Health Program's Dr. Michael Crane touched upon this issue in an interview with Newsweek, stating, "We will never know the composition of that cloud because the wind carried it away, but people were breathing and eating it. What we do know is that it had all kinds of god-awful things in it. Burning jet fuel, plastics, metal, fiberglass, asbestos. It was thick, terrible stuff. A witch's brew." Witnessing and living in post-9/11 New York at the age of 18 gave me something of a fatalistic view on life. I have often felt like I am just waiting for my bizarre cancer or autoimmune disease to kick in from this. So far, I've been fortunate physically. I only have a very early case of hypothyroidism that no doctor is formally willing to connect with my exposure to all of those toxins. September 11th Victim Compensation Fund was established by the feds to aid people who were exposed to the Twin Towers toxins and developed cancer. It was initially headed by someone who was instrumental in getting Vietnam veterans compensation for damage from Agent Orange exposure. The fund covers exposures that occurred from September 11th all the way through May 30th of 2002. That is my entire freshman year of college. Unfortunately, I lived and went to school 10 blocks too far north of their extremely limited area of coverage, and so I would not qualify for their assistance. Aside from the smell, I remember just a few things about being a student and a witness that year. Fortunately, I was in art school where emotions are mined and processed. My first dramatic writing classes were like group therapy. Before we even started learning about anything, we were engaged in serious conversations with our professors, who were all serious professionals, about the value, struggling to find the value of our craft in the shadow of such horror and grief. Many students lived in NYU housing towers that were very near ground zero. They were all displaced for at least the first semester, forced to take up temporary housing in spare dorm beds, and later hotel rooms rented by the school. I remember professors taking the time to get regular updates from them in classes. One guy in my freshman dramatic writing classes had spent his early 20s as a bartender in Miami so he could save enough to attend the dramatic writing program to pursue a screenwriting career. His NYU residence was so close to ground zero that he was able to grab a camera and run down to the area after the first plane hit. He captured an amazing photo of the second tower with the dust ring around the top just seconds before it crumbled. It's not that photo, but that's pretty close. He turned to run as it came down, but he lost hearing in one ear from being so close to the extreme air pressure and sonic force of the second tower's collapse. The last major thing I remember about the first weeks after the attacks is that the NYU graduate psychology department swarmed the dining halls, trying to get us to fill out surveys for a research study on how our memories of the 9/11 event would change over time up to 20 years later. I remember filling out my first one, another at 1 year, and another at 5 years. I anticipated but did not get another one after that. I searched, but I can't find any publication that looks like the direct results of the study. I suppose this piece is my answer to that gap. Sorry, I'm feeling dry. Just a year or so ago, when I encountered the first-hand account I read to you earlier, I was surprised to learn that I don't have those memories anymore. I know that I was honest and what I recorded is true, but I can no longer access those experiences through my own mind. This is what caused me to consider and question memory. What is it? Where does it live? What does it do to us? How does it change over time? And how does it change us? First, I want to wrestle with what memory is. It involves the senses, primarily sound and vision, but it can be triggered by a smell or a taste. It is a private, personal experience of something out of place and out of time. Memory is a kink in the brain which expresses itself like a ghost. Ugly memories would interrupt my day and drag me back to their dungeon so they could hurt me and feed off my bleeding psyche a little more. I didn't want them and I couldn't stop them. I couldn't purge them or process them. I wasn't old enough or rich enough to drink them away. I was angry and frightened at these intrusive memories of violence, fear, and sorrow. I was angry at myself for failing to control them and feeling trapped by them instead. They have made me want to kill them and escape myself. Sometimes I thought I could only escape them by killing myself. As sharp as they can be at first, memories do fade in our minds over time. I don't have any personal memory of seeing anyone seek refuge in my dorm's lobby, but my mother tells me I related that to her on the day of the disaster. That memory lives in her mind. My vivid first-hand account lives not in my mind anymore, but in the copies of the Philadelphia High School Literary Magazine that the moms keep under beds for years in boxes, waiting for their moment to be valued as history. Historical artifacts are valuable because we believe that the objects hold the memories of their time. These are the shoes I wore on the street 20 years ago today. They were not immediately precious artifacts. I already had them for about 5 years and I wore them all the time. I used them, abused them, and after they became unwearable, I kept moving them with me from apartment to apartment, closet to closet, unable to gather the will to toss them. They have lived in the back of my closets for about a decade now. While the actual molecules of the souls that walked on the ashes of the Twin Towers 20 years ago probably wore off a long time ago, I believe the memory of the Twin Tower disaster lives in them still. I believe that memory can even live in our bodies outside of the brain's memory system. Science tells us that our cells change over completely every 7 years, so the physical structure I inhabit now is not the same one I had 20 years ago. Yet I believe somewhere in me, like shrapnel, it lives with the rest of the traumas. Pieces of the harrowing experiences are still lodged in my guts. I believe my fight or flight system got stuck on overdrive, pushing my immune system to overreact and eat my thyroid gland. Let's consider why we remember and why we should remember. Memory is central to learning. It helps us know where home is and what is safe to eat. Memory is central in making meaning. It is the basis of everything from our personal identities to our national identities and our religions. When we remember together, we affirm our worldviews and that the memory is based on something that actually happened in reality with real effects. Okay, they're done now. How do we remember a thing like 9/11? Storytelling and the formalized act of remembering are as old as language itself. When I, as a first-hand witness, share my memories with you, I ask you to take a little bit of my memory as your own. Audiences and witnesses affirm and they support. I do not have to relive it alone this time. Of course, the entire globe wants to know who did this and why. History books and a special exhibit at the World Trade Center Museum tells us that a group of radical Muslims, led by Osama bin Laden, operating under the title Al-Qaeda, were responsible. They had a feverish hate for Western culture. Taking out the high holy places where America worships money demonstrated their righteousness and power. I acknowledge the alternate theories that 9/11 was an inside job. I'm not sure it makes any more or less sense than any other narrative, and I'm not sure it matters either. No foreign national government power was behind this, but the US took the opportunity to invade not one, but two nations, Afghanistan and Iraq. The war on terror was launched. I remember seeing lots of marches in the streets to protest the military invasions. Most of us felt angry and betrayed that our fresh and still bleeding tragedy was being twisted and exploited to serve some nefarious hidden economic agenda, probably having to do with oil. Another government response was the Patriot Act. This allowed for an unprecedented amount of government surveillance on its citizens in the name of national security. This was the dawn of the age of everything being on camera all the time, and New York was swift to adopt the policy and install the equipment. To me, this is the point in history where the whole world went paranoid. Another government response was the Patriot Act. It was the beginning of the modern airport nightmare. Security lines, taking off your shoes for metal detectors, and random baggage checks at airports are a direct result of the 9/11 hijacking. Even more extreme is that for several years, New Yorkers were subject to a random search of their belongings before getting on the subway or any commuter railways into or out of the city. Paramilitary officers were at most stations, and they could just take you aside and search you anytime they felt like it. The Patriot Act and the War on Terror did not protect my individual freedoms or make me feel safe. It limited me through fear by injecting a constant military presence and threat of search and seizure. In the days and months immediately following the disaster, I heard the word sand in front of the N-word to describe people from the Middle East and/or Muslims. The towel heads they were really angry at were the people actually involved in hijacking all of those planes. Instead, harassment and hate crimes against people of South Asian, Central Asian, Middle Eastern, and anyone who looked like they were Arabs were lumped in as targets. Anyone practicing the Muslim faith was also lumped in and considered a potential threat. Their places of worship were closely monitored by the government. They were at risk of violent street attacks by average angry citizens. America was viewing its own citizens with suspicion and fear of infiltration in the same way they did the Japanese during World War II. It was just a different ethnic group. About a week after the 9/11 attacks, a whole lot of important figures, from senators to media moguls, received letters that contained spores of the anthrax virus. Some of the recipients did die from the exposure. America was under bioterrorist attack and afraid of its domestic mail. The top internet search result for anthrax in the US mail after 9/11 is a link from FBI.gov, so I had to check it out. As you can see, the special investigation of the event has officially been named Amerithrax. That is the only thing in this whole show that made me laugh, and I fully expect there is at least one Philly band called Amerithrax. My 9/11 experience has permanently compromised my sense of safety. It expresses in some funny ways. One is that I have never worn very high heels. I developed no stiletto skills and no pointy-toe bunions because I expect that at any moment I will have to run away to escape something or someone. For many years, my nightmares have almost always involved a heavy sense of dread and strong resistance at having to go back to college in New York. In the dreams, I am compelled to go back because I haven't actually finished my degree, or I am supposed to move out. It's rarely set on or in the 9/11 scene, but it's always an emergency situation, and I am always desperate and in chaos. About 6 months after the Twin Tower attack in the spring of 2002, a lot of women on the streets began to show evidence of a baby bump. I was never very interested in having kids myself. I preferred stuffed animals to dolls. But it was after the Twin Tower attacks that I began to experience strong, angry, visceral reactions to every pregnant woman I saw. How dare anyone bring a child into this rotten world? They are sure to suffer from disease and depression, and they will witness unspeakable horrors. No one can shelter them from these things. I realized that I was finally firmly convinced that life is suffering without enough joys or comforts to balance it and make it okay. In my heart, it is seared that to bring an innocent, vulnerable soul into this human experience on purpose is, when you have any other choice, is selfish and ignorant and wrong. This has affected many of my life choices and my relationships. I have never been pregnant. I have always been very upfront in my dating life that I will not be having anyone's child ever. It is usually very polarizing news. When female friends of mine have told me they are pregnant, I get a feeling like being punched in the gut by the nervous butterflies. It doesn't matter if I objectively know that the parents are financially or emotionally wealthy enough to care for a child. I feel betrayal and anger. It's as if the woman has gone to the dark side and become a different enemy species that I can no longer relate to. This anger at and need to withdraw from pregnant women and mothers extends through the infancy and young childhood. The children themselves fill me with a sense of fear at their vulnerability and dread at all the suffering I'm sure they will endure in their lifetimes. I recognize these feelings as irrational and generally opposing the natural order of things, but they are a part of me as much as any physical disfigurement. As I have accepted this about myself, I have gotten a little better at putting my face on and articulating my tolerance limits instead of acting out. I have managed to maintain or pick up relationships with some of these friends who are also now moms, but I never enjoy looking at pictures of their kids. Most of them have little to no idea I am so uncomfortable and struggling so much internally. I am still trying to answer this question. How do you live with all that? 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 It is all over the news that the U.S. has finally thrown the towel and withdrawn all troops from Afghanistan. Some people in this audience cannot remember a time before the U.S. occupation. The fallout of the event that I witnessed 20 years ago today has been warping minds and taking lives for an entire generation. Families have great gaping holes from those that lost their lives in the 9/11 attacks, and later from exposure or military combat. People like me are still trying to find a way to feel safe and peaceful and fully okay. The everything is under control, stiff upper lip, carry on message that we were fed and ordered to follow was about national security. We couldn't let them know just how much impact they had, otherwise we show weakness to the world. shutting down far enough and long enough to really protect the safety and well-being of U.S. citizens would be to admit that in this single act, they won. My young civilian female life was put at risk every day for 8 months to save face. Of course, institutions and families, lost and seeking something to believe and preach, absorbed and clung to the carry-on idea. Everything and everyone around me told me that sticking with the plan of living in downtown Manhattan and getting my bachelor's from NYU were the only things that mattered. It was a rare and super cool opportunity that would certainly set me a life for fame and success. Besides, my trustworthy government said I was safe and made sure of it with cameras and metal detectors and random searches. It was not important how much I struggled mentally and emotionally because I wanted to get out of there. It was not important how much toxic dust I was inhaling and ingesting. It was not important, so I was not important, and my instincts were wrong. I denied and tried to swallow all my danger alarms and misgivings. This mindset took over the way I thought and felt, and it got me into some real trouble over the years. I stayed at NYU, and I graduated from there with a 3.8 GPA in the typical 4 years. The whole time I harbored a strong and urgent need to get out. Since I wasn't able to satisfactorily escape through my life choices in a physical way, I sought comfort in the more immediate and internal cover-up feelings of starving yourself and cigarettes and various other poisons. The only other option was a full, miserable madness. Trauma does not affect everyone the same way, and not everyone experiences the same events as trauma. Statistically, it is true that other people in these same shoes on September 11, 2001 would not have been so deeply affected. I expect plenty of other witnesses in my demographic went on to have a full standard life, even wearing spike heels and having children who now wear them. As for me, my whole being was seared and branded. The results of the search, what age group does trauma affect the most, returns many studies showing that people between the ages of 18 and 24 are most susceptible to developing post-traumatic stress disorder. It is prevalent among veterans of war for that reason, and as most combat soldiers are in their late teens and early 20s. It usually spells poorer health, physically, lower quality of life, and shorter lifespans for those with the condition. I have engaged professional help, both through behavioral therapy and psychiatry, both immediately after the trauma and intermittently throughout my life. They failed to keep me from completely derailing by the end of college. I lost faith in the treatment systems and institutions, and have maintained a tenuous relationship with them since. My trauma experiences have made it difficult for me to believe that there is a God that cares about humanity, and so religion has been very little comfort. My only completely safe, reliable, and healthy coping mechanism is art, either making or engaging with it. And that is what brings me here today. I have managed to build a life that works for me, and I have even learned to enjoy it sometimes. There are many people I have known and worked with for years who have no idea all of the sorrow and fear are a part of my inner life unless they are watching me here today. I'm grateful that memories can and do fade. I'm grateful I figured out that new and different experiences help to ease the trouble because they force you to grow and adapt and think of yourself differently. I'm glad to have the ancient power of theater, ephemeral, eternal, magical, and human, for catharsis. It's time to move on. It's time to get going. What lies ahead, I have no way of knowing. But under my feet, baby, grass is growing. Yeah, it's time to move on. It's time to get going. A broken skyline, moving through the airport. She's an honest defector, conscientious objector, now her own protector. A broken skyline, which way to love land? Which way to something better? Which way to forgiveness? Which way I go. It's time to move on. It's time to get going. What lies ahead, I have no way of knowing. But under my feet, baby, grass is growing. It's time to move on. It's time to get going. Sometime later, getting the words wrong, wasting the meaning and losing the rhyme. It's nauseous adrenaline, like breaking up a dog fight, like a deer in the headlights, frozen in real time. I'm losing my mind. It's time to move on. It's time to get going. What lies ahead, I have no way of knowing. But under my feet, baby, grass is growing. Yeah, it's time to move on. It's time to get going. Thank you.